Dr. Wiener is joining us today in my beautiful mansion in Pacific Heights to discuss all things San Francisco. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Now, just before we dive in, what brought you to San Francisco? Because you're not from here, right?
So I'm not. I'm from New Jersey, Philadelphia area. I always thought I would go back to Philadelphia because that's where my family is, but I decided I should check out another city, and so during law school I spent a summer in San Francisco and fell in love with it.
Oh, and you never left. You're back.
Yeah, 25 years later.
Wow,
Yeah.
Got it. So what about this city, just culturally speaking, what was so captivating about this place?
You know, this is a city that not always, but often embraces change and looks towards the future, and it's a place where people who don't always fit in elsewhere, whether you're LGBTQ or you're an immigrant, it's a place that will welcome you and you can be who you are. And for me as a gay man in particular, being able to be in this amazing city that helped birth the modern queer movement was just exciting.
Wow. So you, just because I've never been to the East Coast for long term, what is the main difference here? Because I hear this all the time. The city's a bunch of people who are transplants.
Yeah.
And they never want to leave afterwards. So what is the difference, honestly? I was born and raised here, so I don't know. I know different, but
yeah. Well, the East Coast is great, and being in the Northeast, here in Philly or DC, New York, Boston. The great part about that is these cities are all interconnected. You can hop on a train. I wish we had a train here. We don't, or not a good one. But but there's something about the West Coast that is just it's so progressive and welcoming, and I just really like that.
Yeah, I've always noticed that there's something about dreams. Historically, California was about the pioneers, the gold rush. Coming to California or Hollywood or even Silicon Valley, it's a place where dreams are made. You can here almost be of nothing and make something of yourself. Versus there's a little bit more older money, I think, on the East Coast. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, there's some of that. There's plenty of old school kind of people here, and that's great. It's a great part of the city. But it is a place where you can be someone who arrives and you get involved, and that's not held against you, and and you can rise in politics or elsewhere, and it is that kind of environment.
So tell me about your rise in politics. You came here for law school, you spent a little summer here. So you didn't go into law, you did, I think, for a little bit, and then you hopped over to the other side.
Yeah, no, I actually practiced law for the first almost 15 years that I was here.
And what was your subject, just curious?
I spent about 5 years at a private law firm, one of the big firms doing corporate litigation.
How sexy.
Sexy. And then I switched over to the San Francisco City Attorney's Office where I did jury trials, defending the city in court when it got sued. So I did have I guess half of a legal career, 15 years.
That counts.
Yeah. But I was always deeply involved in the community. And when I came out to San Francisco, I had been involved in college in politics. And when I came here, I decided I did not want to be in politics anymore. I wanted to do community work. So I got involved on the side, outside of my legal work, helping build the LGBT Community Center and just doing other kinds of LGBT
HRC and all that stuff too,
yes.
yes.
And then, but over time, I just got pulled back into politics, volunteering on campaigns and getting involved in the Democratic Party and in LGBTQ politics. And it was like a gravitational pull for me, and I eventually ran for office.
Oh gosh, and here you are.
Yeah, here I am.
Yeah, I honestly think that we've crossed paths many, many years ago when you were a young attorney. I was a young real estate broker through different gay networks and parties, HRC events, and just to see you ascend to this amazing space. It's just, everyone's so proud of you.
Oh, thank you.
It's just you're just blazing trails left and right. So, I mean, if no one's ever told you that recently, I'm telling you now.
I appreciate that. I'm just so grateful to this community that has always stuck with me and supported me and been there for me so that I can be there for the community. And it's an amazing community.
Who are you advocating for this, right now? Who's your biggest, what's your cause du jour?
Well, I mean, I'm always doing work on housing.
Of course,
that's always the bedrock. But this year, and I always do a lot of work around mental health and addiction treatment, trying to make it easier for people to access mental health treatment.
Right.
And then to understand that drug use and addiction is not a criminal issue, it's a health issue, and we need to give people access to health resources and not, throw people in jail.
Right.
But I'm also this year very, very focused on LGBTQ kids here and around the country, and particularly with what's happening in places like Texas and Florida, and places where these kids are getting criminalized and they're threatening to take trans kids away from their parents and put them in foster care and arrest the parents. And so we're working on legislation to make California a place of refuge where if they come here, we're not going to cooperate with those other states and trying to send them back or whatever. So that's a passion for me, always, but particularly right now.
Wow. Gosh, so I mean, it's kind of continuing the legacy of California and the Bay Area, just like fighting for the rights of minorities and whatnot.
Yep.
Wow. I mean, have you gotten like pushback at all? Like, I mean, do you feel it's something that's just like what has been the biggest? Because right now the whole anti-trans thing is so powerful. I mean, they've really come into their own in the cultural zeitgeist with RuPaul's Drag Race, and just a lot of other things. Not that they're necessarily trans or drag and all that stuff, but like, what is going on to the point where it's being legislated? Like, how does one culturally explain this hate? Out of the blue?
I think it's really, it's scary, and it shows that as much as we think things have changed, they haven't always. And people, I don't want to be dramatic, but I think with everything happening in the country and the world right now, I don't think it is dramatic. People forget that in the 1920s, Germany was one of the most progressive countries on the planet, and Jews and LGBTQ people rose into, especially Jews were rising into positions of, in the business community and as public officials, and everything seemed great. And then boom, Hitler comes along, and then all of a sudden 6 million of them are killed, and LGBT people are killed, and so forth. And so things can change really quickly, and the hatred doesn't just evaporate. And so we've made so many strides as LGBTQ people with marriage equality and more states than before that are protecting our civil rights and being able to serve in the military. And now we're having another backlash where basically anyone that sticks up for LGBTQ kids is now labeled a pedophile or a groomer. They say that openly. We see this notion that even talking to school children about the history of the LGBT community, or Stonewall or Harvey Milk is somehow
promoting the homosexual agenda, or even grooming, which is such a disgusting accusation. Wow,
it's disgusting, and we thought we left that behind, and here it is back in mainstream political discourse, where we have governors of states and members of Congress who are and big media personalities who are able to talk about this. The Pandora's box has been open, and we know that when this happens, more queer kids commit suicide. Right? When they are receiving those toxic messages, they engage in self-harm. And so we need to be really clear. And so I was just this morning on a Zoom, because we're doing this legislation to protect trans kids and families that come here. We now are creating a coalition of states, of legislators, of LGBTQ legislators, because there are more of us than before in a lot of states, to all introduce similar legislation to make clear that we're building this rainbow wall, and we're not just going to let them do this. We're not just going to play defense, that we're going to go on offense and make clear to these kids that there are a lot of people and powerful people who have your backs.
Representation truly matters, and I just think that nowadays, under the social media era we're in, like back when we were kids, if someone bullied me in high school, the second I got back home, I was essentially safe. Now it's like a 24-hour assault on your phone. It's like, and so it's so much more important to be doing this kind of work, because I mean, I feel like it's just gotten out of hand. And it's, but you're right, it's always been there, kind of undercurrent, and it just takes a certain like pivot in the cultural zeitgeist to kind of bring it up to the forefront. And here we are. Right? I just saw this movie. I'm so gay, but Cabaret. I'd never seen that movie.
It's a wonderful movie.
I was flabbergasted, and the fact that KQED had just like was airing it for a reason, I saw now. It's like life is a cabaret. You could turn your head to the left and just like ignore everything. Life is a cabaret, old chum, or just fight the fact that this terrible change is happening, and whose side are you going to be on, basically? Right? And it's like, I guess history does truly repeat itself.
Yeah.
It's distressing.
It does. And we know that with marginalized communities, there's always a risk. And that's why we have to be mindful with what happened on January 6th wasn't just about, Donald Trump being mad that he lost the election.
Right.
That was an uprising against
Yep.
so many of our modern, progressive, inclusive values. That's what that was about.
Yeah, that was like a harbinger of things that were kind of in the undercurrent.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of marginalized, fill in the blank, housing. I mean, people are feeling kind of marginalized in our city now in terms of like affordability, and you've done a lot of work with that. So how's that going right now?
We're making progress one step at a time, but we in California and around the country, we used to do it the old-fashioned way. That as your population grew, as your community grew, you just built more housing so that you had enough housing for everyone. Right. And we used to do that in California, and then about 50 years ago we stopped, and we decided that building housing wasn't important, and that having views and street parking and so on and so forth was more important. And so we created 1 million roadblocks to building housing. We made it through zoning, through everything. We made it really hard. And 50 years later, we are one of the worst states in terms of how many homes we have per our population, the ratio. We see it's not a coincidence that we have the highest rate of homelessness. It's not a coincidence that we have middle-class families that are moving out because they can't afford appropriate housing for a growing family. And so we need to turn it around and say, no, housing is an important thing. We embrace housing. We want a pro-housing policy, and we're doing that step by step. But the politics are tough, and it just takes time to turn that boat around.
Is it a matter of zoning, for example, or NIMBYism? Like, here in San Francisco, everything is very low level with certain exceptions in the District 9 over there. But basically, is it a matter of just doing high rises, like a Manhattanization of the city? Or is it more just like the older powers that be just don't want things to change?
It's a mix. So zoning is part of it. It used to be you could build apartments pretty much anywhere in San Francisco. And then in the 70s and 80s, the city downzoned and said that in most of the city, you can only build a single family home or maybe a 2-unit building. And that creates a math problem in terms of how many units of how many homes you built. And then we created an unending process where even if it's zoned for 20-unit apartment building and you try to build that, it might take you 3, 4, 5 years to get it approved, which is very expensive. You might get sued. And so we created all of these obstacles, and NIMBYism is part of it. But most people want to see more housing, but the NIMBYs are very organized, loud, they have a lot of time on their hands, they'll show up for a 6-hour hearing at City Hall, and most people are trying to work and put food on the table and raise their kids and get their kids' homework done, and they don't have time to do that. And so I think the political dynamic is shifting. We saw it in a recent assembly race in San Francisco where the candidate that robustly proclaimed himself for more housing won in a landslide. And housing was the central issue in that race. And I think it shows that the politics of housing in San Francisco and elsewhere have completely shifted.
Yeah. I think that people who come to San Francisco are fairly transient. I was born and raised here, so I just feel like coming for school or for a startup, for work, and oftentimes once they either start having children or they've been here long enough and they've gotten out of their system, they either move back to where they came from, which is fine, or they moved out to the burbs. In San Francisco, there's a middle class that's been cratered. You're either ultra high net worth or you're on the opposite spectrum. Everything in the middle is kind of gone. And so even people to be vested into politics, normally you would be going to your local politicians and meetings, but when you're only gonna be here for 10 years, before you start, you kind of, the population doesn't really get so vested. And so I feel like a lot of people have left during the pandemic. And I think the people who've kind of stayed here are actually people who actually care about the city. For example, the whole school situation that happened recently. I mean, that was really a grassroots, local families who were kind of taking their stand. So, I mean, maybe there is hope after all, right?
Absolutely there is. And if you look at the death of San Francisco has been predicted. It's like a national sport to predict the death of San Francisco. And this city always roars back. I remember after the Great Recession. If we were supposed to be dead.
Yes.
And we roared back, and we've roared back over and over again, and I know that we will again. And population has been going up again in San Francisco. A lot of people I know who have left are coming back, and new people are coming here, and there are a lot of people who just, they hold on, who are not wealthy and have a family, and they want to stay here, they want to raise their kid in San Francisco. And so I'm optimistic, but we do have to acknowledge we have problems, that we need to build a lot more housing. We need much better mental health and drug addiction support for people, especially those on our streets, and we have to get much more committed and serious and consistent about that. But there's a lot of good things happening in the city. You look at our park system in San
the new
Francisco.
park just opened. I haven't been there yet.
But that Francisco Reservoir. But all over the city in the last 20 years, we've renovated pretty much every park, every pool, every rec center, every playground, everything. Every library has been rebuilt or renovated. We have so we have these amazing things happening in the city that are wonderful resources for families, for single people, for everyone. So I'm optimistic about the city, but we just have to look in the mirror and be willing to tackle these problems.
I feel like what we're going through right now isn't unique to San Francisco, LA, New York. But why do you think SF why are we the punching bag?
Well, I think the world is obsessed with San Francisco because we are the best city in the world.
Quote that. That's right. Quote that.
It's true. The world is obsessed for the good and the bad, and so they love to point out our warts. The national press does, but I found, like, when I was on the board of supervisors, I would do something local in San Francisco and we'd get a call from a European newspaper asking about it. And so, San Francisco, it represents a certain spirit and energy, and people, I think, which people admire. And so they watch us, and they watch what we're doing, and often what we're doing, they laugh at us at first, and then 5 years later, they're doing the same thing.
That's what they say, right?
Yeah.
If it happens in, what's that phrase? It happens in California, it's happening online or something like that.
It spreads around, but they also like to look at our, the problems we have, and sometimes they overstate it. So listen, we have certainly problems on our streets in San Francisco. There's no doubt about it. But if you read sometimes the national press, you might think that it's impossible to walk 5 feet in San Francisco without stepping on a needle and human feces. That is not true. There are certain parts of the city where it can be a challenge, but most of the city, it's not like that. And there's a certain, I think, image that people have of San Francisco that's not always true.
Well, people always love to just topple things who are on top. It's hard being on top.
Yeah.
Let's be honest, right? I mean, so, we're like Cat with 9 lives. I mean, we're going to resurrect
and
again.
You look
and
at,
we're on,
oh, sorry.
So, we're on the upswing already. I can feel it, even on the real estate side. Like, during the pandemic, there was a big reshuffling or exit, but now that things are kind of getting back to quote unquote normal, I mean, there is a revivancy happening again, and the companies are having people back in here, and I think like it's just a matter of being on the edge, on the cutting edge as we are always going to take the hits the hardest. But I mean, I'm still here and born and raised. I thought when I was growing up here, I was going to go to New York or Paris. I'm still here 44 years later, So there's a lot to love. So I'm so happy that you feel the same way and you're out there advocating for us.
Yeah,
so,
it's an honor.
Okay.